where we left off in part one. I wanted to continue that, still talking about ancient Egyptian religion. I wanted to also talk about how foreign gods were also part of their religion. We had a lot of cultures moving in to ancient Egypt, and one of the things about the ancient Egyptians was they allowed people to hold on to their cultures. They would allow them to continue worshiping their own religions. A lot of the times, they would have their own leaders within the community. That would be kind of held accountable by the Egyptians, and sometimes these groups would get large enough to overthrow the Egyptian government, which had happened a couple of different times. So they would sometimes incorporate different foreign gods as well into their religion. And also rebirth was a central theme of Egyptian religion. They believed that after death that they would be reborn again. And unlike Christian culture or whatever, the ancient Egyptians believed that you could take it with you when you died. And so we do see a lot of the artifacts that we have left over from ancient Egypt. A lot of them are from tombs that were packed to the gills for these pharaohs and for these other wealthy people, of all of the things that they were going to take with them into the afterlife. They believed in sort of an afterlife, almost kind of like a happy hunting ground, a place with plentiful game and resources, but you wanted to be prepared. And so sometimes people would be buried with their ships. There were several instances where people were buried after they died. They went ahead and mummified the wife along with them so they could have the wife in the afterlife. Lots of kind of strange stuff was going on with that, but a lot of the artifacts that we have are from those tombs. They believed that we had a soul, and the soul was broken into three different parts: the Ba, the Ka, and the Ah. And one part of the soul couldn't live without the other. So if one died, they all died. And so that is why we have mummies in ancient Egypt, was because of this belief in those three different aspects of the soul. The purpose of it was to keep all of the soul's three different parts alive. And so I wanted to talk about those three different parts. We have the Ba, and the Ba was depicted as a human-headed bird. It represented the personality, character, or individuality of the deceased, and it lived inside of the tomb with the body, but was allowed to leave the tomb and come back at will. It could visit the land of the living, where it could take on any form. It could turn into a cat. It could turn into anything and kind of visit the land of the living. And so a lot of times people would think, when they'd see a cat or something like that, oh, that's one of my relatives coming to visit me. We also had the Ka. The Ka was the double of the person, and it was sometimes represented as a human figure with raised arms, or just a pair of raised arms. And the creator god Khnum fashioned the Ka at the time the person was conceived, and it was an exact physical and emotional replica of the individual that was imprisoned within the living heart and was only expelled by death. It had to stay close to the body at all times and could never leave the tomb. It was believed that the Ka could not live unless the body was preserved, and so you had to preserve that body. If the body was not preserved properly, the Ka could live inside of a picture of the body that was depicted on the wall of the tomb. And so we do see a lot of these funerary portraits that were buried with the bodies as well. So it could live within a picture. I think that is pretty amazing. The Ka was also dependent on the objects and offerings that were left in the tomb. After a person died, your responsibility was not over. You had to go and feed these people. You had to visit their graves and leave things behind for them, either wine or water. A lot of times, dried fish and things like that for the soul to eat. I think that that's kind of unusual, but we do kind of do the same thing now when we visit a tomb. We leave something of ourselves behind as a tribute, whether it be flowers or, pouring a 40 out or whatever. So it was up to the friends and the family of deceased to leave regular offerings at the tomb. Dried fish and fowl were some of the foods left by the relatives to nourish the Ka. And then the third part of the soul was the Ah. And the Ah was represented, it represented the immortality of the deceased. And like the Ba, it was sometimes depicted as a bird, and it could make the journey to the underworld so that it eventually could take its place in the afterlife. That was the part of your soul that went into the afterlife, or the underworld, or the heaven. Um, So when we're talking about that, that is the reason for mummification, was their belief. Their religious belief caused this mummification. We had to preserve the body as good as we could. And so the Egyptians believed that it was important to keep the soul alive. Mummification, it wasn't only just a surgical procedure, or a procedure that you did surgically after death, but it was also a religious ceremony as well. And so the priests who participated were trained to perform the process with both surgical and ritual precision. The embalmers were required to work and labor outside of town. They had a small place. It was called a wabbit, and that was it's also called a clean place, and that is where you would take a body after death to be preserved in mummification. The head priest that supervised the ritual wore a terracotta mask in the form of Anubis. You've probably seen these masks before. If you've ever seen an ancient Egyptian who looks like it has a Doberman Pinscher head, that is the god Anubis, or the head of Anubis. And so that must be a priest who is usually working from mummification. It was important that the priest did not make any unnecessary cuts in the body, because if the spirit could not recognize the body, it would be doomed to not wander, across the earth and possibly haunt the priest responsible. So not only did you have to be surgically precise, but you also had to be spiritually or religiously precise and perform the right rituals at the right times and not make any unnecessary cuts and do everything just the right way. Because if you didn't, you might be haunted by that person's soul. The entire preservation process took about 70 days to do. So after death, it took about 70 days before the mummy was ready to be, entombed. 70 days. We have quite a different turnaround now, but 70 days, that's a long time. For a distant aunt or something, you might forget that they died after 70 days. But yeah, after the process was complete, the body was wrapped in linen. Death masks were placed on the head of the mummy around the bandages to be used as a replacement head in case something happened to the real skull. Now, that wasn't always the case, with some of the, with pharaohs, it happened. Probably one of the most well-known pieces of ancient Egyptian artifacts is King Tut's death mask, that gold death mask. But special amulets were placed within the wrapping of the mummy to protect it. And finally, a mummy tag, similar to our toe tags, was placed around the mummy's neck to help identify it for burial as well. Now, where they were buried, it said the rich and the famous in Egypt were buried in a building known as a mastabas. And a mastabas was a flat-roofed building with sloping sides, had a shaft in the middle of the building, down to another chamber where the body and the goods of the deceased would be housed. So it had sort of a room in the top, and then a shaft that went down, and you were buried kind of below ground. And that's also where a lot of the things that were you were buried with were as well. Now, that is how most people were buried. This is what one of them might have looked like. We see that subterranean vault down on the bottom. I don't know if you could enter that and leave the dried goods and things for the deceased at the top of it, or if they were walled off. I wanted to show you this. This is King Zoser's step pyramid. This was about 2630 to 2611 BC, and this was one of the very first pyramids that we see. It's a stepped pyramid. Now, this started off as a mastabas. It had a single layer, it looked like, and then they just kept adding these steps on top of it, and it looks a lot like those ancient Near East ziggurats. It looks like a ziggurat with that stepped appearance, but it has a completely different function. While the ziggurats were designed as places for priests to inhabit the top of it, and also for government buildings, a sort of a government agency on the lower levels, this was designed just for a single pharaoh's tomb. So it shows you that the ancient Egyptians really believed in the afterlife and really took great care and concern, especially for their pharaohs, when it came to designing these places to deposit their bodies. They've spent a lot of time and energy. Now, right now, when we look at it, it looks just like a pile of rocks, kind of rough and everything else. But at the time, it did not look like that. When it was built, it wasn't as rough as it looks now. It was probably faced a lot like the Great Pyramids, which we'll get into a little later, with a really smooth, a lot of the times highly polished limestone on each of those steps, which gave it just a lot cleaner of an appearance than it is now. But since it is in the desert, and they did use smooth limestone to, face the pyramid, being in the desert, it's kind of like being in the middle of a sandblaster. So a lot of that smoothness and the highly polished kind of quality of these things has been just destroyed just because of the sand and everything blowing in the air just over generations and thousands of years, just blowing into it and just getting rid of all of that kind of the highly polished kind of look of all of this stuff. Zoser was the first pharaoh to build a pyramid. Like I said, Imhotep was the designer, and he built this mastaba for him, and then he constructed the 4-step pyramid. Later, it was expanded to a 6-step pyramid, and the step pyramid is rectangular with 6 levels, over 195 feet in height. Now, I wanted you to look at this: 195 feet in height. That is a really large stepped pyramid for one person's body to be in. 195 feet. That is what? I don't know. Like a 20-story building. The height of a 20-story building. It looks like something that you could just kind of scale up here in the photo, but it's actually super giant. Well, I guess maybe kind of on scale with those ziggurats as well. Like I said, it was originally faced with limestone. We see these stepped pyramids, and then we also see these pyramids starting to not be stepped anymore, and we start seeing these pyramids just smooth out into the sort of the pyramid shapes that we kind of associate with ancient Egypt. I wanted to talk about some of those, and those are the pyramids of Giza, or the Great Pyramids. They were around 2551 to 2473 BC, and they were built for 3 Old Kingdom pharaohs from the first dynasty: the Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Khafre was Khufu's son, and Menkaure was Khafre's son. So it was a grandfather, a father, and a son, kind of in succession. These great pyramids were built for. That must have been a period of great wealth and stability for the country for them to spend that much effort building these pyramids. But it was it wasn't just the pyramids, it was also a funerary complex. It included temples, chapels for offerings and ceremonies, mastabas for noble families, and it also had connected causeways, or elevated roads, between the pyramids and between all of these temples, because at the time when it was built, these pyramids were in the middle of some water. It was in a river harbor, and so we had these elevated passageways between these pyramids. I can't imagine what this must have looked like with the water and the pyramids and the boats and the elevated walkways and everything else around it. It must have been just absolutely spectacular. Let me kind of show you what it looks like now. The river harbor. The river has changed course since then, and now it looks like it is definitely in the desert, or the red soil of that of ancient Egypt right now. Unfortunately, a lot of the other sort of the connecting things have been destroyed or are missing, but we still have a lot of them as well. It was also, like I said, originally faced with a polished limestone, like King Zoser's pyramid. It was plundered during the Middle Kingdom. This is during the Old Kingdom when these pyramids were created. It was already plundered during the Middle Kingdom. I cannot imagine the amount of vast treasures that must have been in these pyramids. These pyramids were gigantic. Who knows what was stored in these things, but we won't know because everything was already stolen out of them, even before the ancient Egypt was over. You always hear about the curse of the mummy. Hey, don't go into that pyramid. There might be a mummy there. And just in popular culture, you hear that kind of stuff. Well, those things were set in place to prevent people from going in there and robbing them blind. You were afraid that you were going to get some kind of a curse. Well, apparently it didn't work because these things were already looted even before the ancient Egyptian culture was completed. Everything was stolen out of them. It's a shame. Um, when we look at these things, just the amount of work that went into them was crazy. Herodotus, who was a historian at the time who traveled all over Europe and all over the ancient Near East and Egypt and everything else, reported that gangs of 100,000 men each worked in shifts for 3 month periods.